Let's talk, though, now about some of the substantive critiques. You have written about defensive gun use estimates on either end of the spectrum and the weaknesses of them, the strengths of them. So why don't we get into that? Because, this was the sort of core of the justification for why these things were changed, or why they were, why the CDC decided to make a move here. And so, why don't we start with the one at the center of all this, the Gary Kleck survey, and really kind of general critiques of survey-based estimates, because you read through it, Hughes's argument kind of devolves into you can't really use surveys to estimate defensive gun uses for a number of reasons. And so why don't you go over for us just the main problems with trying to figure out how many times people use a gun in self-defense by asking them directly?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, on one level, it's kind of the obvious thing to do, right? Call a bunch of people, you get a good national random sample and ask them, if they've used a gun in the past year or so. There have been basically a number of issues raised with this approach, though. One is that, especially if you're asking over a limited time frame, like some of the Kleck surveys asked that you have used a gun in self-defense in the past year, you run into a problem where, because it's a pretty rare event, if even a small percentage of your respondents answer incorrectly, whether because they're making something up or because they're reporting something that didn't actually happen in the past year, or are just confused about the question or what have you. Basically, even if only a small number of people answer incorrectly, that's going to swamp the rare occurrence of the people who actually did use a gun in the past year.
Because I think one thing that most people will be confused by is calling it a rare event, right? Because you got 2.5 million. That's a lot. That's not rare. But I suppose the way you're calculating that is based off of 1% of the population says it happened, and 1% of the population is about 2.5 million.
So if you
not even 1%.
Yeah, I mean, basically the idea is that if you talk to 100 people, and even one out of every 100 people you talk to is full of it for whatever reason, that can create a 1% result that gives you the 2.5 million.
And this isn't an issue with just measuring defensive gun uses. Yeah. It's sort of a general critique of any survey that looks at relatively rare occurrences.
Right. Yeah. Like if you ask people, are you a Republican or a Democrat? You're going to have the same problem where some people answer incorrectly, but because, Republicans and Democrats are roughly equal in nature, so they'll cancel each other out to some extent. And also the vast majority of people are going to answer correctly. So the few people who get it wrong are not going to have that big of an effect on the result. When you have something that's extremely rare, or at least fairly rare, that's when the incorrect responses start to really rack up your total in a way that you don't want.
Doesn't this also affect then the way that the CDC and others estimate how many victims of gun violence there are? Because that would be a fairly rare event too, right? Yeah.
Anytime you have the NCVS, for example, is another. It's a survey that estimates. It's a survey of the general population that asks them about their experiences with crime. There could absolutely be a similar issue there, where if some number of people make something up or report something from the wrong time frame or what have you, that's going to inflate those numbers. And it's hard to. Obviously, we have much better data, I think, from especially police departments on crime that's actually reported. But what the NCVS tries to do is fill in the gaps of what wasn't reported to the police. And when it comes to that, that's
but it can be vulnerable to that same issue.
Yes.
But that's obviously not the only critique of Kleck and other survey-based estimates, which tend to put the number into the millions per year.
Yeah.
They tend to be somewhere between 750,000 to 3.5 million. I think is the highest that's been out there. So they tend to be on the fairly high side.
Yeah.
And the other big critique, which Hughes does make in his argument to the CDC, is that were there that many defensive gun uses in real life, you would see evidence of that, like sort of concrete evidence of them more often. Things like media reports or hospital admissions for gunshot wounds would be much higher. Isn't that's another common critique, right?
Yeah, I mean, and to take, for example, the newer English study that addresses the problem, I think, a bit with the rare event thing, because he asks about if they've ever.
He took a different approach.
Yeah,
right?
so
he wasn't asking just over the last year. He said ever, and then divided by the average number of years lived among respondents. As an adult, right?
So that I think was an interesting choice and a good choice. But the thing is that when he still though produced a pretty high result. I think you said it before, it was 1.7, I think, but that was only among gun owners, and at least in the collect data, there were a fair number of non-gun owners who said that. That was the other limitation from English. English actually says that if you adjust it according to Kleck's estimate of how often non-gun owners do it, it would be as high as even higher than 2.5 million total. So he has a really high number as well. But the thing is, as you said, if you have even 2 million, say, defensive gun uses. And if you look at these surveys also collect other information about what happened, including whether a gun was discharged. In the English survey, it's about 20%, I think, that said they fired a shot.
It's very low.
Shot, but it's 20% of 2 million is 400,000. That's 400,000 defensive gun uses with shots fired. So those cases should be a bit easier to find. You're not going to find 100% of them, because not all. Even in urban areas, sometimes gunshots go unreported.
Right. Well, actually, so the English, I think the English study is a little different, because it has 30 years of hindsight to sort of correct for some of these critiques, or at least take them into account. And so I do want to talk a little more about how it does that. But for right now, the main critique was about the Kleck survey in the 90s, and that survey did ask whether people had reported their self-defense shooting to police, or the police had become aware of them. And it got a very high number for that, right? And this is the basis for why Hughes and Bryant argue that it can't be true, because it was like 64%.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, actually, frankly, I find the shots fired issue much more problematic than the police finding out about it issue, because when you report something to the police don't keep a tally of defensive gun uses. When the FBI puts out its annual statistics that it collects from police departments, there's no category for some type of crime was stopped by a gun.
But this is their critique, though, right? They say, hey, the Gun Violence Archive only finds 2,000 incidents a year, or somewhere around that number. That's sort of the average that they've identified since they've been keeping count. Back in like 2013, I believe, was when they started. But they, and so if there had been 2.5 million gun defensive gun uses, and 64% of people ended up reporting these to the police, you'd have, millions of incidents that would be in police records or would have made the news. And we can only find 2,000, and that's the largest sort of database of, at least reported incidents of defensive gun use that exists. So these numbers can't possibly be real. Right? Hughes calls them criminologically impossible results.
Then you can maybe make that kind of argument, but they're not doing that. As you mentioned before, if you go through their data, overwhelmingly they're relying on things that are not only announced by police departments, for example, in press releases or things, but are actually reported in the media. I think I did poking around in there, see one or two that were maybe a Facebook post from a police department or something to that effect.
Yeah, it seems like that's what they mean by police reports, is like police press releases.
Yeah, I don't see that they're going through and going through all of the police reports that are filed to see if how often people are calling the cops to say, hey, some guy tried to break into my house, or I caught a guy in my house and I chased him off with a gun. If every once in a while something like that will be reported in the media, and you'll find that. But overwhelmingly what they have is different. I actually downloaded their defensive gun use data. For some reason, it only gives you the 2022 numbers when you hit the download button on that webpage. But they have about 1,000 so far for 2022. And they have have data on how many people were injured and how many people were killed. And it's something like 95, 96% of these cases have somebody injured or killed in them. So
I think you said only 4 didn't have that.
Yeah, right? I think it was 4% didn't have somebody injured or killed. That's obviously not capturing all the times when people are, using a gun in self-defense and there's no injury or death. And I didn't comprehensively review them, but I poked around a bit in some of the cases where there are 0 injuries or deaths. Every once in a while, you will find a local news story in some small town where some woman chased a burglar out and the guy's on the loose and they wrote a story about it. But pretty commonly, these are fairly extreme cases where there was a shootout in a store that somebody tried to rob, but nobody was hit. I remember there's one case where a guy was viciously beating a pregnant woman in a parking lot and a gun owner stopped him. I mean, it's pretty obvious why the media is covering that and why it's getting into the
they're basically high profile incidents of
these
defensive gun use.
I think the idea of calling that a comprehensive count of gun uses just doesn't pass any sort of test. I mean, that's obviously way too low. How low it is an open question, but it's obviously not capturing defensive gun uses comprehensively.